There is something worth noticing in how the most active beekeepers in any apiary are rarely the ones with the best colonies. You see it over and over. The beekeeper who is always in the hive, always pulling frames, always checking, always busy with the hive tool. That beekeeper is often the one with the weakest production numbers at the end of the season, and the one who seems to do the least is often the one who does the best. This pattern is not random. There was a time when it was understood precisely enough that some of the most experienced practitioners in American beekeeping wrote it down. They documented what every inspection actually costs a colony, costs most beekeepers today have never been taught to consider, and they described a method for reading a colony from the outside that gave them most of what they needed to know before the hive was ever opened. That method is not complicated, but it requires something that the modern inspection habit has largely replaced. And if you've ever opened a hive and felt like you left it worse than you found it, leave that in the comments below. You're not imagining things. The cost of a single hive opening is something most beekeepers have never thought about, because the modern culture of beekeeping frames inspection as a necessary and essentially neutral activity. You open the hive, you see what's happening, you close it. The bees go back to work. This picture is incomplete in a way that compounds over every season. When you open a Langstroth hive on a spring day, say 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which most beekeepers would consider reasonable working weather, the brood nest inside that hive is operating at a different temperature entirely. The bees have maintained that nest at 92 to 95 degrees. That thermal environment is not incidental. It is the biological condition that allows bee larvae to develop correctly. When the outer cover comes off and the interior is exposed to ambient air, the brood nest temperature begins to drop within 2 to 3 minutes. Open larval cells, larvae in their first 6 days of life, before capping, cannot regulate their own temperature. They depend entirely on the bees around them to maintain the warmth they need. On a 65-degree day, a 5-minute inspection can drop the brood nest temperature enough that the bees will spend the next 45 minutes to an hour thermoregulating back to target. That recovery is not free. It consumes honey stores. It occupies workers who would otherwise be nursing brood, processing incoming nectar, or building comb. The colony is spending biological currency to recover from an intervention that the beekeeper experienced as neutral. And that is the cost of a single, well-intentioned inspection on a reasonable day. On cooler days, the cost is higher. Below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the risk to open brood is not theoretical. It is measurable. This is the first thing the beekeepers who opened less often understood. Not as biology. Most of them had never heard the word thermoregulation, but as outcome. They noticed that colonies inspected frequently during the spring build-up were slower to reach peak population than colonies left alone during that period. They noticed that the hive opened every week in April was not the hive that filled the supers in June. The connection was not always obvious because the costs were distributed across weeks and showed up as a modest deficit rather than a visible disaster. But the pattern accumulated, and the most careful practitioners learned to take it seriously. There is another cost to the frequent inspection habit that is less obvious than temperature. It has to do with something the colony spends months constructing, and that a single inspection partially undoes in a matter of seconds. Honeybees apply propolis, a resinous compound gathered from tree buds and bark, to seal the interior of their hive with a precision that looks, if you pay attention, like deliberate construction. Every small gap, every joint between frames and box, every crack along the runners. Over time, a well-established colony coats its interior with a continuous antimicrobial envelope that reduces bacterial and fungal loads inside the hive. Researchers studying colonies in natural tree cavities have documented this propolis coating and noted that hives with intact propolis envelopes show significantly lower pathogen pressures than disrupted ones. The bees are not decorating, they are defending. Every time you open the hive, you break that envelope. The propolis bonds between the cover and the box, between the frames and the runners, crack and separate. When you close the hive again, those seams are open, the bees repair them. That repair takes time and resources. Propolis gathering requires flight, and the processing and application inside the hive diverts workers from other tasks. In a colony inspected weekly through spring, the propolis envelope is never fully complete. The interior defense the bees are continuously trying to build is continuously being partially undone. The commercial beekeepers who managed 200 and 300 colonies in Ohio and Indiana in the 1920s and 1930s were not restraining their inspections out of philosophy. They were doing it out of arithmetic. You cannot open 200 hives every week. The time and labour cost makes it impossible. So the practical beekeepers of that era, the ones who kept careful records and whose operations survived across decades, developed a working knowledge of what a colony communicated from the outside, not because they preferred observation to inspection, because their operations required it. And what they found, documented in the beekeeping records of that period, was that the external communication a colony produced was more diagnostic than most beekeepers expected. Detailed enough that an experienced observer could resolve most questions without opening the hive at all. If this kind of biological framing changes how you think about what inspection is actually costing your colonies, a subscription helps this content reach beekeepers who are ready to hear it. Now, what does a hive entrance actually broadcast? And how precisely can it be read? Moses Quinby was writing about this in the 1860s. Not in the language of pheromone chemistry or thermal biology. That language didn't exist yet. But in the language of a working beekeeper who had managed enough colonies to see the pattern clearly. Quinby's Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained, published in 1853, describes the habit of standing at the entrance of a hive for 2 or 3 minutes before reaching for any tool. He was reading, not inspecting. He was gathering information from what the bees were broadcasting from outside before deciding whether an interior examination was warranted at all. A.I. Root, whose ABC and XYZ of bee culture became the dominant American beekeeping reference of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was explicit in the early editions that experienced beekeepers could determine a great deal about colony condition from the entrance alone, and that many inspections were unnecessary if the beekeeper had developed the habit of reading the exterior first. C.C. Miller, who kept bees for 50 years in the upper Midwest, and whose 50 years among the bees remains one of the most practically grounded accounts in American beekeeping literature, went further. Miller argued that a disturbed colony told the beekeeper less than an undisturbed one. But the information available inside the hive during an inspection was, in certain respects, less reliable than the information available outside the hive before it was opened. Because the colony in a state of disruption is not behaving normally, the beekeeper is observing a colony responding to intrusion, not a colony operating according to its own biological logic. That observation sounds simple. Its implications are not. The entrance of a healthy queen-right colony in a normal operational state presents a specific pattern of activity that, once learned, is readable the way a set of tracks is readable. Not identical every time, but consistent in its structure. The most basic signal is forager traffic. On a day with available forage, a healthy colony sends foragers out in a continuous stream beginning shortly after first light and peaking in the late morning. The bees departing are carrying nothing. The bees returning are carrying pollen in the corbiculae on their hind legs, or moving with the slightly lower, forward-leaning flight profile of a bee carrying nectar. Both are diagnostic. A colony with normal forager traffic, normal pollen return and smooth departure and return cycling is, in most circumstances, a colony that does not need to be opened that day. The traffic is the signal. The traffic says, this colony is operating. The abnormalities are equally specific. A colony with reduced forager departure on a suitable flying day is a colony where something internal has changed. The possible causes are several: queenlessness, congestion, disease pressure, or the onset of swarm preparation, but the signal itself is clear before a single frame is pulled. A colony with high defensive activity at the entrance, bees flying short aggressive arcs near the landing board, is a colony whose alarm threshold has dropped. That can mean queenlessness, active robbing pressure, or recent disturbance. A colony with bees clustered at the entrance in the early morning in the oriented, outward-facing posture of bees waiting for a departure signal, not the loose, gravity-hanging clustering of summer heat, is a colony in the early stages of swarm preparation. That signal is available at the entrance before a single queen cell has been drawn. Sound is a separate layer of information, available from 2 feet away before the cover is lifted. A healthy queen-right colony in warm weather produces a steady, even hum, not loud, not variable, not urgent. The pitch and the evenness of that hum are not details, they are diagnostic. A colony that has lost its queen produces a different sound. The evenness is gone. There is a higher register, a quality that experienced beekeepers in the 19th century described as anxious, and that modern researchers have confirmed corresponds to measurable changes in the colony's vibrational communication. A colony in the roar of a nectar flow sounds different from a colony in dearth. A colony preparing to swarm sounds different from a colony that is simply congested. These are not subtle differences once you have heard them enough times. They are the colony broadcasting its state in a medium that most beekeepers today no longer have the habit of listening to. Dead bees at the entrance are a third signal, and one of the most specific. A healthy colony produces dead bees. That is normal. The question is the morphology. Intact bodies at high volumes suggest starvation or pesticide exposure. Bees with shriveled, crumpled wings are a varroa signal. The physical expression of deformed wing virus, a pathogen vectored almost exclusively by varroa infestation. The entrance dead bee count, examined for 5 minutes, provides a differential that most beekeepers would take 30 minutes to confirm through frame inspection. This is the protocol that the commercial beekeepers of the 1920s and 1930s were working with. Not written down as a formal method, practiced as a habit. 5 minutes at the entrance before the hive is opened. Sound assessment before the cover comes off. Traffic pattern, pollen return, defensive posture, dead bee morphology. 4 layers of information gathered in sequence before any physical intervention. That protocol answered most questions, and the questions it didn't answer. Confirmed queenlessness requiring a new queen introduction, active disease requiring brood inspection, honey weight requiring a super, were the questions that actually required opening the hive. The rest did not. That was the point. Most inspections are not diagnostic. They are habitual. The beekeeper opens the hive because it has been 7 days. Because opening the hive is what beekeepers do. Because the alternative, standing at the entrance watching and listening, doesn't feel like management. It feels like doing nothing. But doing nothing and observing carefully are not the same thing. And the practitioners who understood the difference opened their hives less, disturbed their colonies less, preserved the propolis envelope and the thermal environment and the pheromone distribution that allowed those colonies to function as coherent biological units across the season. Their results spoke clearly. Not in any single dramatic moment, but across seasons, in the accumulation of colonies that performed consistently without the rhythmic disruption of weekly inspection. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from doing everything right, as far as you can tell, and still ending the season with less than the colony should have produced. The strong colony in April that should have filled the supers and didn't. The hive you checked every single week and still somehow missed the swarm. The colony that looked fine every time you opened it and then quietly failed before winter. That frustration has a cause, and in some proportion of those cases, the cause is not disease, not weather, not the flow. It is the inspection habit itself, the repeated disruption of the biological processes that would otherwise have run correctly if they had been left alone. We don't talk about this easily because the inspection habit feels like diligence. It feels like responsible beekeeping. The beekeeper who opens the hive every week believes he knows what is happening in his hives. And in one sense he does. He has seen a great deal of brood and frames and queens and cells. But what he may not have seen is what those colonies could have been if the inspections had been fewer, more purposeful, and preceded by 5 minutes of reading what the entrance was already saying. The beekeepers who opened less often and outperformed their neighbours were not doing something mysterious. They had developed the entrance first habit to the point where most of their information came from outside the hive. They had learned to read traffic patterns, sound, defensive posture, and dead bee morphology as a diagnostic sequence that preceded any physical intervention. And when that sequence gave them their answer, which it usually did, they moved to the next hive without reaching for the hive tool. The practical application of this today is not complicated. It requires a habit change, not an equipment change. Before every planned inspection, stand at the entrance for 5 minutes, not glancing, actually watching. Count the forager departure rate, note the pollen return, listen to the hum before you lift the cover. Check the entrance for dead bees and note their condition. Ask, based on what you are observing, whether the question you came to answer actually requires opening the hive. In a large proportion of planned inspections, the answer from the entrance will be, this colony is operating normally, traffic is normal, sound is even, pollen is returning, no unusual dead bee morphology. There is no diagnostic question that requires an interior examination today. Come back in 3 weeks. And when the entrance does give you an abnormal signal, when the traffic pattern is disrupted, when the sound has changed register, when you see shriveled wings at the landing board, that is when the inspection is justified. Not because it has been 7 days, because the colony is broadcasting something specific that you cannot resolve from the outside. When to open and when not to open is not a rule. It is a question that the entrance can answer most of the time if the beekeeper has the patience to ask it. The practitioners who understood this were not passive, they were precise. There is a difference between a beekeeper who doesn't know what's happening in his hives and a beekeeper who does know, because he spent 5 minutes at the entrance before deciding whether the hive tool was warranted. One of them is guessing. The other one is reading. Filingsavarani 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 is reading. One of them is guessing. The other one is reading. The habit of opening less and observing more is not something most beekeeping guides will recommend today. The inspection schedule is too deeply embedded in the standard management culture, but the colonies managed by beekeepers who had developed the entrance-first diagnostic habit in the decades before that culture took hold don't need to argue the point. Their production records made the argument for them. If the entrance of your hive has been speaking to you before you open it, the question is whether you've been positioned to hear it. Share what you've noticed below. And if this kind of biology-first approach to colony management sharpens your practice, subscribe. There is more historical precision ahead, the kind that costs nothing to apply.